At my parents' 40th anniversary dinner, I was publicly erased from my own family, and the only person who didn't abandon me was waiting at the gate. My name is Isla Dawson. I'm 34, a senior portfolio strategist for an education investment fund based in New York. I manage millions for other people's children, but somehow I was never enough for my own parents. My mother, Vivian Dawson, has always believed that anything beautiful should be displayed loudly. She never hosted modest dinners, never allowed fake flowers, and she certainly never forgave a daughter who brought a practical gift to a symbolic event. I forgot that part, or maybe I hoped this year would be different. They said the gathering was important, a big night, my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, so I flew in from New York, took a week off work, rented a car. And I brought Leo Marin, my partner. Leo is 36, Italian, a robotics engineer turned minimalist. He's calm, quiet, and annoyingly perceptive, the kind of man who notices tension in your silence before you even speak. He didn't try to insert himself, didn't ask, didn't push. He just stood beside me, hands in his pockets like always. I had spent 3 weeks working on the gift, an original 1984 wedding album digitally restored, printed on handmade cotton paper, leather-bound, with their initials embossed in gold. I handed it to my mother. She flipped through 3 pages and said, my dress was terribly outdated, but thank you, dear." That was the first crack. The party was set in the backyard of our Santa Barbara home. Golden lights strung across old oak trees, jazz quartet on a rented stage. 70 guests in silk, linen, and shoes with names I couldn't afford at 24. My Uncle Robert toasted to love that lasts. My Aunt Carolyn cried, talking about their Santorini trip. I stood to say something, but my mother beat me to the mic. We're so lucky to be surrounded by so much love. Even Isla managed to fly in from New York, though she's apparently been too busy to call her parents in the last 3 months. Light laughter. Leo squeezed my hand, I smiled through it, then her tone shifted. It's easy to let success go to your head. Some people forget where they come from, but just because you have fancy titles does mean you outgrow your family. Even the jazz stopped. I walked slowly toward the mic, each step like crossing a frozen lake. I haven't forgotten where I came from, Mom. That's why I'm here. That's why I restored your wedding album, paid for the kitchen repairs, covered the new roof, sent money for Michael's summer program. I just didn't post it online. Her face hardened. Then she leaned forward and said, cold and clear, "If you think you're too good for this family, Isla, then go. This isn't a company for you to manage. It's a family." The air turned still. Not a word from my father, Richard Dawson. Not a glance from my younger brother, Jard. Not even a twitch from anyone else. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't ask why. I set my wine glass down, looked at her, and said, "Then I'll leave, so you can have your perfect celebration, without the burden of a daughter who became invisible the moment she became useful." I walked past the oak trees, past the string lights, past the matching white chairs. Nobody stopped me. Leo was already waiting by the gate. He didn't ask what happened, didn't offer comfort. He simply opened the passenger door and asked, "Where to?" I looked back once, at the glowing house, the laughter that no longer included me. "Anywhere," I whispered, "as long as it's not there." That's how I left the house I grew up in. No goodbye, no questions, no name called after me. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like relief. 3 weeks after I left, my phone lit up, not with an apology, but with a demand. That's when I started digging. That's when everything unraveled. The first 3 days were quiet. I stayed at a friend's guest house near the coast, minimalist, white walls, soft light, a porch swing that creaked just enough to remind me I was alone. Not abandoned, just alone. Leo flew back to Lisbon for work. He offered to stay. I told him not to. I needed to hear myself again, without the noise of obligation. By the end of the second week, I'd signed a short-term lease for a 1-bedroom apartment above a bookstore in Carpinteria. Hardwood floors, slanted windows, the kind of place where the stove hums when it heats and the blinds never sit quite right. But it was mine. No sticky notes on the fridge, No passive-aggressive remarks about being too busy to visit. No Jard, no debt disguised as guilt, just silence and space. Then, on a Tuesday morning, exactly 21 days after the party, I got a text from my father, Richard. "Hi. Just wondering, did you send the mortgage payment this month? No, how are you? No, we miss you. No, can we talk?" Just a line item. I stared at the screen. Smiled, dry, humorless, not because it was funny. Because it was so predictable. I didn't reply, not immediately. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, watched people rush to work, grab breakfast, kiss goodbye at traffic lights. It hit me. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to rescue anyone. 10 minutes later, I texted back, "Oh, I thought I wasn't welcome anymore." The typing dots appeared instantly, then vanished, then reappeared, then came the flood. My mother Vivian called, voicemail, texted, called again, then Jard chimed in, "Wow, way to destroy the family just to prove a point." I didn't answer, not yet. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were panicking because their lifeline had walked away. By evening, my inbox was burning. "Mom, you're punishing your parents over one silly argument. We've sacrificed so much for you. You're really going to let the house go." Then came the voice messages, first crying, then shouting, then calm, manipulative sweetness, classic Vivian. Push, then pull, shame, then sugar. I poured a second glass of wine and opened my banking app, scrolled through the transfers. $1,200 here, $800 there, $3,000 for emergency roof repair, $2,400 for Jard's auto accident. It went on and on, 2 years of digital breadcrumbs. And suddenly I realized, even when I was paying, they'd still been behind. I called the bank, 3 transfers, 15 minutes on hold. Finally, someone answered. I explained. "I've been helping with the mortgage, but I'm not listed on the account. I just want to check the payment status." The woman hesitated, professional but strained. "I can't share full details since the account isn't in your name. But I can tell you this. It's been delinquent for several months." I sat up, defined several. Pause, then. "They've only made partial payments for the last 8 months. 8 months, even during the months I was paying." I stared at the wall, not sad, not surprised. Just hollow. Where had the money gone? The spa gift cards I found in Vivian's purse. The new patio furniture Jard posted on Instagram. The urgent dental work Dad supposedly needed right before a golf weekend in Palm Springs. They weren't surviving. They were spending. I reopened my banking app, hands steady, mouth tight. I added every transfer to a spreadsheet, sorted by date, labeled each one, mortgage, groceries, utilities, Jard's excuses. Over $62,000 in total. Clean, no strings, no questions, no thanks. My phone buzzed again. Jard. "She's crying, Isla, just call her." I snorted. I was the one who cried quietly in bathrooms after sending my paycheck to cover their overdue bills. I was the one who said no to vacations, to a new car, to therapy, because the house came first. But now I was just a selfish daughter who ruined everything. I finally replied, "Funny, you all seemed just fine when the money was flowing. Where did it go, Jard?" 3 dots, then nothing. That silence said more than any lie ever could. They never expected me to ask. They just expected me to give. By the next morning, my phone was a battlefield. Missed calls from Richard, voicemails from Vivian, Jard alternating between guilt and gaslighting like it was a sport. Then finally, Vivian called 5 times in a row. On the 6th, I answered. Her voice came in hot and fast. "What's wrong with you? You can't just abandon your family like this." I didn't raise my voice, didn't flinch. "Where did the money go, Mom?" Silence, then, "What are you talking about?" "The mortgage, the payments I've been sending, the ones the bank says haven't been made for nearly a year." Her voice shifted, tight, defensive. "Well, some of it went to bills, groceries. You know, life isn't cheap. Groceries don't cost $5,000 a month. Your father needed dental work. Jard's car broke down. It was an emergency. The one with the custom rims and Bluetooth stereo. That emergency." Boom, silence. Then she snapped. "Don't you dare make it sound like we're reckless. We've done everything for you, you owe us some support. I took a breath, then another. You didn't support, you expected, you manipulated, and now that I've stopped being useful, I've become disposable. That's when Richard took the phone, his voice softer, almost rehearsed. Isla, we just need a little help. One last month. To avoid foreclosure, we'll fix it after. I laughed, quiet, flat. You've been saying we'll fix it for years. And every time I sent money so you didn't have to. I stood paced across the room. Let me ask you this. If I hadn't questioned the mortgage, how long would you have kept lying? Silence, then Vivian's voice returned, lower, weaker. We didn't mean to lie, we were scared. We thought if we told you the truth, you'd stop helping. So you lied. To keep the money coming. That was it, the truth, cold, blunt, undeniable. I stared out the window at the ocean beyond the rooftops. Then I said, there's always another way. You just didn't want your way to change. You wanted me to stay the same. Pause. I'm done, Mom. Sell the house. What? Figure it out like adults. I'm done being your bailout plan. And then, I hung up. No apology, no guilt, no goodbye, just a click. And finally, a full, clean silence. After years of silent sacrifice, I finally said no. And this time, I meant it. No more saving them, no more shrinking myself, just me and the line I refused to cross again. The next 48 hours were too quiet. No calls, no guilt-drenched voicemails, no sad face emojis from Jard. That wasn't peace. That was calculation. They were regrouping. I'd seen this dance before. On day 3, it hit. Jard texted, "Thanks a lot. They're talking about moving in with me now. Hope you're happy." I stared at it for a beat, then typed, "They kicked me out, Jard, not the other way around." 10 seconds later, "Yeah, well maybe if you weren't so cold all the time, they wouldn't have to. You broke Mom." Ah, there it was, the sacred family logic. You set a boundary, you're cruel, you say no, you're broken. You stop funding the dysfunction. You're the problem. I took a breath, then typed 4 words, "Not my problem anymore," and hit send. 5 seconds later, my phone rang. Mom, I let it go to voicemail, then Dad, then a group call. I turned off the ringer. Put the phone face down on the couch. I wasn't ready to talk, not until I had proof. Something told me they weren't just a little behind. They'd been bleeding the system, and me, for a long time. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, piecing it all together. The urgent texts that always came mid-pay cycle. The sudden emergencies tied to my paydays. The times they said they were fine when I asked, as long as the money arrived quietly. By morning, I had made up my mind. I called the bank again. This time, I asked for documentation, loan statements, payment history. Even if the account wasn't under my name, I knew what to say. I used to underwrite risk portfolios. They couldn't gaslight me anymore. Eventually, a woman from compliance confirmed, "There have been consistent underpayments since last spring. In fact, your family has been on the foreclosure radar for about 9 months. 9, even while I was sending thousands." I hung up and pulled open my laptop, started a spreadsheet, titled it, "Documented Transfers, Isla Dawson." I listed every payment I had made in the last 2 years, cross-referenced with emails and texts, labeled every cent that had gone toward their emergencies, over $62,000, with receipts, screenshots, PDF exports, timestamps, because I wasn't just protecting my bank account. I was protecting my future from their version of the story, because I knew what was coming next. The revisionist narrative, the emotional PR spin. She cut us off. She's unstable. She's angry. She's ungrateful. No, I was prepared, both literally and emotionally. I wouldn't just walk away, I'd walk away clean. The next day, Vivian finally cracked. One text, "We're selling the house." No greeting, no apology, just surrender. But that text, that hit harder than all the screaming, because it meant they finally knew. I wasn't coming back, not as a safety net, not as a scapegoat, not as a silent bank account with a heartbeat. I thought I might cry. I thought I'd feel the hollow ache of a chapter closing. But I didn't. I made tea, watered my plants, opened the windows. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who skipped dinners so they could eat, who declined job offers to stay close, just in case, who absorbed guilt like a second language. She deserved better. So I gave her what they never could. Closure. A week later, I got an email from Richard. A full essay, measured tone, polite wording, passive regret masked as diplomacy. He wrote, "I'm disappointed in how things have escalated. I hope you'll remember where you came from. I forgive you for walking away." Forgive me, he attached a spreadsheet of their expenses. Mortgage amount bolded at the top, like a final invoice. Like I owed them one last act of devotion. I didn't respond. Instead, I updated my spreadsheet, added footnotes, screenshotted his message, filed it under, attempted manipulation, round 4. Let them rewrite the story however they needed. Let them play victim to their friends, neighbors, holiday cards. I wouldn't stop them, but I wouldn't fund the performance either. And that was the line I drew, in quiet, in calm, in absolute clarity, not out of spite, not to hurt them, but to save myself. For once I chose me. I didn't burn bridges, I just stopped patching the ones they kept setting on fire. And slowly, in the quiet, I began to build something else, a life not built on guilt, but on choice. The house sold 2 weeks later. I found out through a distant cousin, Lana, who texted, "Saw your childhood home on Zillow. Wow, you okay?" I replied, "Better than I've ever been." She didn't know what to say after that, and that was fine. The house on Ridgemont Avenue had been in our family for 29 years. Cream-colored siding, blue shutters, a porch swing that leaned to one side, just like everything else in that house. They didn't tell me directly. No email. No text. No invite to clean out my old room. I guess they figured I'd forfeited the right. And maybe I had, but I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel erased. I felt released. They moved into a smaller rental near Jard's apartment. That I heard from Carolyn, my aunt on Dad's side. Apparently, Jard wasn't thrilled. He says they're driving him crazy. Guess the golden boy's not so shiny under pressure. I didn't reply to that one. I just smiled and turned off my phone. It's strange watching the place you grew up vanish from your life like a house in a rearview mirror. Familiar, but distant, like something you dreamed about once. I tried to summon grief, tried to feel guilty, but it never came, because when I thought of that house, I didn't remember warmth. I remembered folding checks into envelopes, being told I was too sharp when I asked questions, apologizing for not visiting while also paying the bills. That wasn't home, that was performance, and I was finally off the stage. Leo flew back in 2 weeks after the house sold. He didn't ask what happened, he already knew. He walked into my tiny kitchen with a loaf of bread, a bottle of red wine, and said, "I brought groceries," and a question. I raised an eyebrow. He smiled and pulled out 2 envelopes. Plane tickets, Florence, round trip. Flexible dates. One for him, one for me. He didn't push. He didn't say, "Come with me." He just said, "If you want to rest somewhere new, there's a table waiting for you." That night, we sat on my balcony with wine and leftover pasta. I told him everything. The bank, the spreadsheets, the silence that followed. He didn't flinch, didn't offer advice, just listened. And when I was done, he looked at me and said, "I'm proud of you, not because you said no, but because you stopped explaining your yes." The next morning, I booked the flight, one way. Florence was warmer than I remembered, not just the air, the rhythm. There was no checklist, no pressure. Just long walks, fresh espresso, and the quiet miracle of breathing without bracing. I started writing again, nothing big, just essays, reflections, letters to the girl I used to be. I started a private newsletter called Not Your Scapegoat, only 42 subscribers, but every week I wrote a letter like this one. To remind myself I didn't imagine it, that I was not the villain in their version of events. That walking away didn't make me cold. It made me conscious. One morning, Leo and I went to the Sunday market, bought fresh basil, figs, a wedge of cheese that smelled like danger. We brought it home and made lunch, just the 2 of us, at a small table by the window. He poured wine, I set the bread down, and we sat, shoulders touching, no words needed. After a few bites, he said, "If you could go back to that night in Santa Barbara, would you have stayed longer?" I looked at him and said, no. If I hadn't left, I would have missed this table. I don't need a family that calls me cold every time I stop burning myself to keep them warm. I don't need a house that costs me my peace. What I needed was space to build something else, something slower, softer, real, and maybe that starts here. Forgiveness isn't always a door you open. Sometimes it's a window you stop staring at, and healing. It's the life you build when no one's watching. The emails stopped a few months later. No more "we forgive you" from Dad, no more spreadsheets, no more guilt-drenched one-liners from Jard. Even Vivian went quiet. I think they finally realized I wasn't coming back, not as the golden daughter, not as the monthly payment, not even as their villain. I was just gone, and it's funny. When the noise disappears, you start to hear things you'd buried years ago. Like your own needs, like your own voice, like the truth you kept excusing for the sake of being good. One evening in Florence, I lit a candle, not for them, but for the version of me that stayed too long. The girl who said yes when she was drowning, sent money when her rent was overdue, laughed off insults for the sake of keeping peace. I wrote her a letter, burned it on the balcony, watched the paper curl inward and collapse into ash. That was my goodbye. I never sent one to Vivian, never called Richard back, never replied to Jard's last message, which simply said, "You'll regret this when they're gone." Maybe, but I won't regret saving myself. Forgiveness, for me, didn't come in a phone call. It came when I walked past a jewelry store in Florence and didn't think about buying her anything. It came when I stopped rereading old texts, hoping I'd misinterpreted the tone. It came when I could say their names out loud and not flinch. It came when I understood closure isn't a conversation, it's a decision, and I had made mine. One Sunday, I returned to the same market Leo and I always walked. There was a new booth, a woman selling handbound journals. I picked one up, ran my hand across the spine. The cover read, "Your story starts where someone else's script ends." I bought it, went home, and started writing, not about them. About me, not who they told me I was, not who I became to survive them, but who I was now. I wrote about mornings that didn't begin with anxiety, about evenings where no one weaponized were family. About finally cooking for myself, not out of duty but joy. I wrote about Leo, about how love isn't supposed to be earned, how it shows up, sits with you, waits, doesn't demand you shrink, doesn't need you to explain. And then one day, I wrote a sentence I'd never written before. A sentence I used to think was selfish, but now it's a prayer. I forgive them, not because they said sorry, not because they changed, but because I no longer need their story to define mine. That's where I'll end this letter. Not with anger, not with a warning, just with a table set for two, a journal half filled, and a window that no longer looks back. Because I didn't lose a family, I found a self I'd forgotten. And this time, I'm not giving her up for anyone.